For Mexico, 1846 had been a year of bitter defeat. U.S. General Zachary Taylor's forces had routed the Mexican army in Texas and crossed the Rio Grande. There were other losses. U.S. President James K. Polk had sent Stephen Kearny's Army of the West to occupy New Mexico. Within months, California would fall too. But for Mexico, 1846 would also be the year of the return of exiled President Antonio López de Santa Anna. Soon, Santa Anna would meet Zachary Taylor on a barren, windswept plateau in the Battle of Buena Vista. And Polk would open a second front, invading Mexico by sea. If necessary, he would strike the very heart of the country, Mexico City itself, the fabled halls of Montezuma. In August of 1846, a ship from Havana, Cuba, carved its way through the waters of the Gulf of Mexico, bound for Veracruz. On board was a man who was convinced that he would be the savior of his country. He was the exiled former president of Mexico, Antonio López de Santa Anna. The Mexican government of Mariano Paredes had just fallen, and Santa Anna's supporters were clamoring for his return.
Necesitamos un general.
We need a general who would be able to organize an army without money, who has enough, let's say it in whatever way, charisma to attract soldiers and get them to fight without pay, without training, without anything, and who is able to unite certain groups.
Earlier that year, Santa Anna had sent a confidential agent to U.S. President James K. Polk with a surprising proposal. If Polk would allow him to pass through the U.S. blockade of Mexico, Santa Anna would try to bring about the sale of California to the United States. The terms of the offer were vague, and Santa Anna was still hated in the United States by those who remembered the Alamo and Goliad. But in spite of his doubts, Polk agreed to the proposal.
When you face Santa Anna with Polk, you're facing one opportunist with another. They both have that characteristic as a part of their makeup. And if Santa Anna was returning to Mexico without any clear idea of what he was going to do, Polk was using Santa Anna deliberately to gain something that he had not been able to gain any other way, that is, negotiations with Mexico. Of course, what he did not foresee was that Santa Anna would rally his people. This was the danger, but Polk didn't realize what a danger it was.
Now, after a year and a half in exile, Santa Anna was returning home. On Polk's orders, the U.S. Navy allowed him to pass through the blockade. In Veracruz, Santa Anna greeted the small crowd that had gathered to welcome him home.
Mexicanos, there was once a day you called me the soldier of the people. Allow me to assume that title again and to devote myself until death to the defense of liberty and to the independence of the Republic.
The homecoming was uneasy. Not 2 years earlier, Santa Anna's abuse of presidential power had caused an angry mob to smash his statue, exhume the leg he had lost to war, and drag it through the streets of Mexico City. Now, there were already rumors that Santa Anna might have made a deal with Polk.
La gente no sabe si es cierto.
The people don't know if it is true, but the politicians don't have confidence in Santa Anna.
And,
and this is another vulnerable point for Mexico.
porque van a tener, porque van a tener, muchos, 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 muchos,
And this is another vulnerable point for Mexico.
van a tener desconfianza los políticos.
Because the politicians aren't going to trust the general and commander of the Mexican army. A serious thing in a state of war.
Even so, Santa Anna had become the only leader who could unite the country and stop the U.S. invasion. In December of 1846, just 3 months after his return from exile, he was elected President of Mexico again. In the entire United States Army, one man stood out as the general most able to win the war with Mexico. President Polk disliked him with a passion. His name was Winfield Scott. He was the Army's general-in-chief. A hero of the War of 1812 and a superior strategist, Scott had twice gone abroad to study European military tactics. Some found him brilliant and entertaining, yet he struck others as impossibly pompous and vain. Ulysses Grant once remarked that the general always wore all the uniform allowed by law.
Technically, he was far more accomplished soldier than Taylor had been. But in contrast to the nickname of Old Rough and Ready or Old Zack for Taylor, Scott was unfortunately known as Old Fuss and Feathers because he loved military panoply. And he loved uniforms, he loved to have his staff with him, and oh gosh. So therefore, when he got in trouble, people just enjoyed his discomfort.
By the fall of 1846, Polk was convinced he had to open a second front against Mexico. He needed a commander. Polk despised Scott personally and feared him politically. Scott was a member of the opposing Whig Party. For as long as he could, Polk had kept Scott behind a desk in Washington. But now the president needed the general's talent as a soldier. Reluctantly, Polk gave Scott command of the operation.
He was so grateful and so much affected that he almost shed tears. He left apparently the most delighted man I have seen for a long time, James K. Polk.
From the beginning, Winfield Scott had argued that only a major campaign against Mexico City itself would force the Mexicans to surrender. He would do it the way Cortez had defeated the Aztecs: land an army on the coast at Veracruz and fight his way 250 miles up the national highway and into the capital. Scott knew he had to move quickly. Veracruz was known to suffer devastating epidemics of malaria and yellow fever in late spring. An invading army would have to capture Veracruz and move to higher ground before then. The general needed troops immediately. The most available and most experienced were Zachary Taylor's soldiers in northern Mexico. Taylor had established his headquarters in the provincial capital of Saltillo, 75 miles southwest of Monterrey. In January of 1847, he received a letter from Scott.
My dear General, I shall be obliged to take from you most of the gallant officers and men whom you have so long and nobly commanded. General Winfield Scott.
Taylor was so upset, an aide saw him mistakenly spoon mustard into his coffee.
Such a decimation of my army had never crossed my mind. The idea of a further advance with the remaining forces is too preposterous to be entertained for a moment. General Zachary Taylor.
Even at full strength, Taylor's army had always been outnumbered. Now, with his troops reduced to 5,000 inexperienced volunteers, the general knew he was dangerously exposed. What he did not know was that Santana was aware of it too. By this time, in January of 1847, Santana was in San Luis Potosí, north of Mexico City, where he had managed to raise an army of 20,000 soldiers. Bystanders watched as officers hastily organized recruits so inexperienced Many had never held a gun. The troops were not ready, but Santa Anna felt he had to take the field. He was still the target of suspicious rumors concerning his deal with Polk. Critics were questioning why he had not yet fought the invaders. The general had learned from captured documents of Scott's planned invasion at Veracruz. Now he faced a crucial decision. The landing at Veracruz would have to be stopped, but a quick victory first over Taylor's weakened forces would silence those who still questioned his leadership. To march north in the middle of winter was a gamble, but Santa Anna was willing to accept the risk. Now was the time to meet Taylor's army and destroy it.
Saltillo lies on the slope of a hill. The cathedral occupies one side. Its 15 bells chime sweetly. After a hard and dusty march, we entered with music and colors flying. The Mexicans looked daggers, and doubtless had them, but did not dare to draw them. Lieutenant John James Peck.
Cuando los norteamericanos llegan a Saltillo,
when the North Americans arrived in Saltillo at the end of 1846, the citizens received them coldly. They all closed their doors and put black ribbons or bows of mourning on them in honor of the Mexican soldiers who had died at Monterrey, and the soldiers enter and occupy the center of the city.
During the U.S. occupation of Saltillo, soldiers and civilians became more accustomed to one another. And Lieutenant John Peck found time to appreciate his surroundings.
The ladies of Saltillo are pretty, have elegant forms, and move with that ease and grace so peculiar to the Castilians. Oftentimes, they strike the light guitar. In going to my meals, I pass some beautiful creatures. All I can say is, buenos dias and buenos tardes.
No less romantic, but considerably more daring, was a volunteer from Boston, Private Sam Chamberlain. As a boy, Chamberlain had intended to study theology, but instead became a self-described rogue who loved fighting and women in equal measure. He was a self-taught artist, and in his later years wrote a lavishly illustrated account of his adventures during the war. According to what he called his confession, Chamberlain never missed a Mexican fandango, never fought a man he didn't beat, and rarely met a woman who could resist his charm. But Chamberlain was also a keen observer, and in his recollections, he described horrifying incidents of wartime violence. Amid the settled routine of occupation life, death would come suddenly, without warning. Mexican guerrilla fighters would sweep down on U.S. supply trains or pick off individual soldiers, leaving the dead mutilated beyond recognition. Mexican civilians found themselves caught between both sides.
Many of the people living in the small towns, ranches, haciendas, and farms suffered attacks by the Mexican guerrilla fighters because they thought the people were aiding the North American army. And at times, the North Americans attacked them, burned and destroyed their buildings, because they thought the people were helping the guerrilla forces. It was a situation the civilians could not win.
As the occupation wore on, Taylor found it hard to keep discipline in the ranks. Chamberlain wrote that the most abusive and violent soldiers were the volunteers from the southern states.
Looking upon the greasers as belonging to the same social class as their own Negro slaves, they plundered and ill-treated them. We were obliged to patrol the country for miles around camp, to protect the wretched inhabitants and arrest these heroes.
On one of the occasions when Mexican civilians fought back and killed a U.S. soldier, the volunteers from Arkansas, known as Rackensackers, sought revenge. Sam Chamberlain was on patrol when he heard gunfire in the hills.
Cries of women and children reached our ears, coming from a cave at the end of the ravine. A horrid sight was before us. The cave was full of our volunteers yelling like fiends, while on the rocky floor lay over 20 Mexicans, dead and dying in pools of blood.
Taylor was outraged by the massacre and ordered the Rackensackers to return home in disgrace. But before they could leave, U.S. scouts reported a large Mexican army approaching from the south. It was Santa Anna, and Taylor would need every man he had. It was mid-February of 1847. For 3 weeks, Santa Anna and his army had suffered an agonizing journey north through the desolate countryside. Second Lieutenant Manuel Balbantin had survived the Battle of Monterrey. Now he feared he would freeze to death.
It's bitter cold, windy and snowing. Last night some of the soldiers and the women died. The troops, hungry and numb from the cold, refused to march.
Illness, desertion, and death had taken a terrible toll. Of the 20,000 who had started the march, only 15,000 remained. Traveling with the soldiers were an unknown number of women who had chosen to march with the army and care for their men.
These women travel on foot, carrying babies on their backs, carrying small grills for cooking, accompanying the soldiers. And many times they also die. They die of hunger, they die of sickness, they die of abandonment.
Still, Santa Anna pushed his troops relentlessly north, hoping to surprise Taylor's army at Agua Nueva, south of Saltillo. But the U.S. general was waiting for him. At a place where the road to Saltillo ran through a narrow pass the Mexicans called La Angostura. The U.S. soldiers called it Buena Vista, after a nearby hacienda. The position was well chosen. The plateau was deeply furrowed, surrounded by hills and gullies. The broken ground would hamper Santa Anna's best troops, the cavalry. The hills would be almost impossible to take.
So it was defensible. If you could hold those heights, and it's easy to hold down by the gulches, you could defend yourself against a much larger force, which is exactly what Taylor did on the very strong advice of John E. Wool, who was a very, very excellent soldier.
That night, a terrible winter storm blew over the troops, blasting overhead with thunder and lightning. Both sides lay on their weapons, without fires, shivering in the icy wind. The next day dawned clear and cold. Taylor's troops could see that they were outnumbered 3-1. Most of them were volunteers who had never seen battle. Reveille sounded along the Mexican lines. Private Sam Chamberlain watched in awe as the call passed from unit to unit.
A procession of ecclesiastical dignitaries, with all the gorgeous paraphernalia of the Catholic Church, advanced along the lines, preceded by the bands playing a solemn anthem. Their cavalry was magnificent. Some 6,000 in uniforms of blue, faced with red, with waving plumes and glittering weapons, advanced toward us as if they would ride down our little band and finish the battle in one blow. Private Sam Chamberlain.
Early that morning, Santa Anna launched his attack. Mexican troops led by General Manuel Maria Lombardini burst out of a broad ravine and charged against the U.S. line. Breaking through the U.S. position, the Mexican army took the offensive and swept east across the plain. Mexican soldiers advanced along the foot of the mountains and circled around the U.S. troops to seal off the road behind them. Instead, they met the Mississippi Rifles, led by Colonel Jefferson Davis. The regiment had linked up with another from Indiana to create an open-ended V formation. As the Mexican troops charged between the lines, the U.S. soldiers cut them down. Later that day, Santa Anna called up his reserves and ordered an all-out assault. But once again, the U.S. artillery proved its worth. Batteries tore into the Mexican troops with a deadly hail of canister and grape. And the Mexican attack stalled. As night fell, both sides were exhausted. Many went to sleep wondering how they could survive another day.
The evening of the 23rd must have been a pretty gloomy evening for Taylor sitting there at Buena Vista, because his troops were spent from the day's fighting. He knew that in spite of the fact that they had repulsed all of Santa Anna's attacks, he was still vastly outnumbered, and the reinforcements had not come up in any substantial numbers. He had every reason to feel that the next day was going to be a very, very tough day.
Early the next morning, the U.S. soldiers looked out over the battlefield. The Mexican army was gone.
They fell back to Agua Nueva, and Santana mentions in his battle report that he does this because the soldiers are exhausted. They have not eaten for 2 days. They had not been able to eat during the battle, nor have they had water. So he decides to return to Agua Nueva and plans, he says, to attack again in a few days. In fact, he does not.
For Santana, the triumph that had seemed so certain the day before had become a wasted opportunity. The field belonged to Zachary Taylor and his army of volunteers. It would be Taylor's last battle of the campaign, a victory that would make him a hero at home. Still, the U.S. casualties at Buena Vista were the highest of the war so far. 659 men dead or wounded. The Mexican army fared much worse, more than 1,600 casualties. The trail of wounded soldiers stretched all the way to Agua Nueva and beyond. As night fell, many faced a terrible fate.
Men abandoned in a desert, steeped in their own blood, shivering with cold, parched with thirst. On their faces the appalling calm of despair. In sight already were the coyotes and dogs, who awaited the moment when they might begin their frightful banquet.
The first news to reach San Luis Potosí from the battlefield at La Angostura reported a Mexican victory. People rejoiced in the streets as cathedral bells announced special masses of thanksgiving. But when the remnants of Santana's battered army finally returned, the truth was easy to see. The march north had been disastrous. the trip back even worse. Half the soldiers that had started out just 6 weeks earlier were either dead, wounded, or missing. For Santa Anna, there was no time to rest. In Mexico City, a revolt had broken out against his vice president, Valentin Gómez Farías. Desperate for money to fight the war, Gómez Farías had tried to force the church to contribute more funds. In response, National Guard units, backed partly by the church, took to the streets in protest. Many of the rebel officers were from the upper class. The people called them polcos, after the polka, the dance then in fashion among the wealthy. For Mexico, the Polcos rebellion could not have come at a worse time.
The possibility of creating a united front among the different political groups in Mexico is gone. So now anything is possible. Obviously, what is in imminent danger is the very survival of the country as a nation. That's what's at stake.
Even as the government was falling apart, Mexico faced yet another crisis. Off the coast of Veracruz, General Winfield Scott was prepared to launch an invasion of the country. 10,000 soldiers anxiously eyed the coastline. It would be the first major amphibious landing ever attempted by U.S. armed forces. The operation was risky, the consequences of failure devastating, and Scott knew that the odds against him were overwhelming.
He had to land an army, establish a supply base, march 250 miles inland, seize the capital of a hostile nation, thereby bring about a peace, conquering a peace, not conquering a nation. Now that's a very, very tall order, and it was, as I said before, unprecedented practically in history.
In Veracruz, the commanding officer, General Juan Morales, appealed to Mexico City for reinforcements. But the government could not respond. The Polcos revolt had paralyzed the capital.
What madness had seized the Mexicans to provoke a civil war while a foreign enemy was lording over our cities and occupying our territory? Veracruz resigned herself to her fate.
On the morning of March 9th, 1847, the day dawned clear and calm. Scott decided the time had come. U.S. soldiers clambered over the rails of the transport ships into surf boats Scott had designed for the landing. Packed shoulder to shoulder, the men braced themselves for what they knew would be a terrible battle on the beach. At 5:30 in the afternoon, a gun sounded from Scott's flagship. The invasion began. Soon, the first U.S. soldiers scrambled through the surf and onto the beach. To their amazement, not a shot was fired. General Morales and his troops remained behind the thick fortified walls of Veracruz, hoping to hold out until help could arrive. For the next 12 days, Scott's troops surrounded the city with batteries of heavy guns and mortars. On March 22nd, Scott sent an ultimatum to General Morales. Morales refused to surrender. The following day, a battery of 6 heavy naval cannons replied with a volley of exploding shells that arched high into the air before raining down on the city. The guns had been placed by a 40-year-old Army engineer from Virginia named Robert E. Lee.
The shells thrown from our battery were constant and regular discharges, so beautiful in their flight and so destructive in their fall. It was awful. My heart bled for the inhabitants. The soldiers I did not care so much for, but it was terrible to think of the women and children.
The shelling continued day and night. Deadly fires broke out everywhere.
The surgical hospital in the convent of Santo Domingo suffered from the fire. During an operation on a wounded man, a shell extinguished the lights, and when other lights were brought, the patient was found torn in pieces, and many others dead and wounded. José María Castillo Velasco.
For 3 harrowing days and nights, U.S. guns poured an estimated 6,700 shells into the city. By the 4th day, priests no longer dared to venture out to minister to the dead and dying. Finally, the people could take no more. Veracruz surrendered. In Mexico City, the satirical press criticized the government and the military's inability to turn back the U.S. invasion. The capital was still reeling from the Pocos revolt. Once again, it was Santana who was able to temporarily unite the country's divided leadership. The president promised to protect the church from its enemies in the government in exchange for a loan to help fund the war. The scholar and politician Jose Fernando Ramirez criticized the church's loan as too little and too late.
2 months before, with this sum of money, the clergy could have undoubtedly redeemed themselves. They could have saved Veracruz and our nation, and at the same time saved the 300,000 pesos which they used in a civil war. A war which is going to cost us very dearly.
Santana now faced another, even more serious threat. General Winfield Scott and his army would soon be on the march toward the capital. On April 2nd, as crowds of well-wishers lined the streets, Santana left Mexico City with 6,000 troops. Before his departure, he issued a public proclamation, words he hoped would finally unify the nation.
Mexicanos, Veracruz calls for vengeance. Follow me and wash out the stain of her dishonor. To our shame be it said, we ourselves have produced this deplorable misfortune by our interminable discords. Mexicanos, the national cause is infinitely just, although God appears to have abandoned us. The hour of sacrifice has sounded its approach. Your fate is the fate of the nation. Not the Americanos, but you will decide her destiny.
In early April, Santana arrived at his hacienda El Encero. In the past, El Encero had been Santana's refuge from the world of politics and war. Now, it became his military headquarters. The estate was 70 miles up the national road from Veracruz, directly in the path of Scott's advancing army. Here, on his own ground, Santana planned to meet the U.S. invasion and drive Scott's army back to the coast, where yellow fever would finish the job. Not far from his hacienda, in the rugged hills near the village of Cerro Gordo, Santana positioned 12,000 troops. Mexican forces now blocked the road to Mexico City at a point where it cut between steep hills on one side and a ravine that tumbled into a river on the other.
It's on high ground, flanks well protected on the river on the right, and supposedly impassable terrain on the left. His selection of that piece of ground was, I believe, close to masterful.
The position was strong, but the troops were poorly deployed. Santana's officers warned that the enemy might try and circle around them. One of the general's most experienced engineers, Lieutenant Colonel Juan Cano, recommended placing artillery on a nearby hill called La Atalaya. Santa Anna ridiculed the advice.
In almost all of the military operations that he conducts throughout his military career, one can see him imposing his will on others. It was also a product of this arrogance that drove him. I am the only one, the best. And this happens when people come under the influence of that terrible drug called power.
On April 14th, Winfield Scott reached the pass at Cerro Gordo. His troops numbered 8,500 against Santa Anna's 12,000. Some of Scott's officers recommended a frontal assault. Instead, Scott looked for a way to do exactly what Colonel Juan Cano feared he would: circle around the Mexican forces and cut off the road behind them. But the ground was unfamiliar. Scott ordered one of his best engineers, Captain Robert E. Lee, to scout the area. At dawn the next day, Lee slipped quietly out of camp to find a path through the steep ravines.
In the course of his reconnaissance, Lee got so close to the Mexican lines that he all of a sudden got trapped there at one point. And he had to lie behind a log for hours while the Mexicans sat there on the same log he was hiding behind and chatted and drew their water and went back. He was that close. We almost lost a good officer there, but the information he brought back as a result of that was extremely valuable.
Lee's drawings showed Scott that there was a way around the Mexican flank. That night, Scott ordered guns placed on the hill Santa Anna had refused to fortify himself, La Atalaya. At 7 a.m., the U.S. battery on La Atalaya opened fire, taking the Mexican troops completely by surprise.
Our whole force, with a loud shout, leapt the breastwork and met the Mexicans at the point of the bayonet. Here, for just one short minute, ensued a kind of fighting I hope I never see again. It seemed like murder to see men running bayonets into each other's breasts.
By 10 a.m., the fighting was over. U.S. soldiers took more than 3,000 Mexican troops prisoner. 11 years earlier, Santa Anna had been captured in Texas. Desperate to avoid falling into enemy hands again, he raced toward the safest place he could think of, his home, El Encierro. But U.S. cavalry fire forced him to change direction and run to wherever he could find a place to hide.
Santa Anna, the first chief of our nation and our army, a few hours before erect and proud, was now humbled and confused, seeking among the wretched a refuge to flee to.
U.S. soldiers found Santa Anna's carriage and an artificial leg with its boot still attached. News of the discovery spread quickly to the United States, where miniature replicas of the leg became popular souvenirs. To General Scott, the U.S. victory seemed complete. Mexico, he wrote, no longer has an army.
Well, Cerro Gordo should have ended the war. If you'd had a nation that was less determined and a president who was less determined than Santa Anna, probably anybody in their right mind would have sued for peace then. The Mexican army was destroyed. The path was open to Mexico City.
Santa Anna had suffered one of the worst defeats of his life. Still, he would not give up. Even as Scott's victory message was making its way to Washington, the Mexican generals set about reorganizing the scattered remnants of his army.
He was capable of defying all of these incredible challenges. So he says, all right, I have to defend the Valley of Mexico, Mexico City. And he sets out. He sets out to do the impossible.
For Santa Anna, the disaster at Cerro Gordo was already nothing more than a memory. The defense of Mexico City would give him another chance to prove himself a soldier of the people. The war was far from over.
Dear Father, what could have possessed you to send me way off here? Your notions of military glory are altogether too exalted. There is no fun in cutting throats. I've tried it. I am obliged to Mother for her advice, but it's no use to read the Bible in the midst of swords and bayonets. Either I am, or that book is wrong. Anonymous letter published in Yankee Doodle.
As the war with Mexico dragged on, voices of protest began to appear in U.S. newspapers, pamphlets, and magazines. Most people still supported the war, but many had expected the fighting to be over within a few months. Now, with costs and casualties mounting, opposition politicians attacked the president, denouncing what they contemptuously called Mr. Polk's War. Polk fought back, questioning the patriotism of those who criticized him.
A more effectual means could not have been devised to encourage the enemy and protract the war than to advocate and adhere to their cause and thus give them aid and comfort.
Much of the opposition came from anti-slavery forces who believed that the war was part of a Southern scheme to expand slavery. Among those who opposed the president was the abolitionist leader and former slave, Frederick Douglass.
The determination of our slave-holding president to prosecute the war and the probability of his success in wringing from the people men and money to carry it on is made evident by the puny opposition arrayed against him. None seem willing to take their stand for peace at all risks.
Another outspoken critic of the war with Mexico was the then little-known Massachusetts writer, Henry David Thoreau. In an essay later called On Civil Disobedience, Thoreau challenged Americans to follow their conscience.
When a sixth of the population of a nation which has undertaken to be a refuge of liberty are slaves, and a whole country is overrun and conquered by our foreign army and subjected to military law, I think it is not too soon for honest men to rebel and revolutionize. This people must cease to hold slaves and to make war on Mexico.
But the protests of anti-war activists like Thoreau had little influence on the general public, and the embattled president now seemed more determined than ever.
I declared to the cabinet that no alternative was now left but the most energetic crushing movement of our arms upon Mexico. I would not only march to the city of Mexico, but I would pursue Santa Anna's army wherever it was and capture or destroy it.
Set beneath the twin volcanic peaks of Popocatépetl and Iztaccíhuatl, Puebla de Los Angeles, with 60,000 residents, was Mexico's second-largest city. Located midway between Veracruz and the capital, Puebla was famous for its many beautiful churches. Now, it found itself in the path of war. On May 15, 1847, the first U.S. troops arrived.
At 12 o'clock precisely, the vanguard of the invading army entered the south gate and marched to the grand plaza fronting the cathedral. They stacked their arms and supplied themselves with water from a fountain, a Carolina volunteer.
The streets were swarming with the multitude as far as the eye could reach. Our little army of 4,000 was completely lost in the crowds that pressed around us, examining us pretty much as they would the animals in a menagerie. Captain Kirby Smith.
With the occupation of Puebla in place, Scott took the time to rest and reorganize his troops. Some took advantage of the opportunity to walk the streets of the beautiful old city. Many a New England Congregationalist or Ohio Methodist was astonished by the opulence of a Poblana church. And at Cholula, just outside Puebla, U.S. soldiers marveled at the sight of a gigantic pyramid more than 1,000 years old. It was raised by the Toltec people to honor their god Quetzalcoatl. Later, the Spaniards built a Catholic church on top. Many of the soldiers had read about Cholula in a popular book called The Conquest of Mexico by William Prescott.
Many soldiers carried copies of the book with them. They used it as a kind of guidebook, and they wanted to visit all of the sites that Cortez had been identified with, that they'd read about in Prescott's book.
And when our flag has been upheld and crushed lies each presumer.
Inspired by their role in what they saw as a grand historical drama, U.S. soldiers picnicked atop Cholula and dreamed of glory.
To conquer the descendants of the Spanish conquerors and to plant the flag of our young republic upon the capital reared centuries ago above the ruins of Montezuma's palaces. What prospect more captivating to the youthful imagination?
But there were others, like Lieutenant John Peck, who looked ahead and saw that if glory came, it would come at a price.
Our force is small, not quite 10,000, with an inadequate siege train and small supply of ammunition. I am confident we cannot be beaten, but we must oppose great odds and decide by the bayonet.
In April of 1847, President James K. Polk made one of the most important decisions of the war. He would send a diplomat to travel with Winfield Scott's army. His name was Nicholas Trist. He was second in command at the State Department. He had served as U.S. consul in Cuba and was fluent in Spanish. Trist was also well connected in Washington. He was married to Thomas Jefferson's granddaughter and had worked closely with Presidents Andrew Jackson and James Madison. The diplomat's assignment was to accomplish what the invasion so far had been unable to achieve: successful negotiations with Mexico.
Unfortunately, he was a man with a very thin skin and a man of rather hot temper and a compulsive writer who wrote long dispatches and long letters in which he said many things that he should not have said.
On May 6, 1847, Nicholas Trist disembarked at Veracruz. Almost immediately, he managed to offend Winfield Scott. Trist sent a sealed peace proposal to Scott's headquarters, instructing Scott to pass it on to Mexican officials. But Trist did not bother to inform the general of the proposal's details, and Scott was incensed at the thought of being bypassed.
The Secretary of War proposes to degrade me by requiring that I, the commander of this army, shall defer to you, the chief clerk of the Department of State. The question of an armistice or no armistice is most peculiarly a military question appertaining of necessity to the commander of the invading forces. The safety of this army demands no less. General Winfield Scott.
Trist's reply took 6 days to compose and filled 30 pages.
The course determined upon by our government is what any man of plain common sense would take for granted that it must be. And it is not what your exuberant fancy and over-cultivated imagination would make.
If you dare to use this style of address again, or indulge yourself in a single discourteous phrase, I shall throw back the orders and instructions with the contempt and scorn which you merit at my hands.
For more than a month, Scott and Trist refused to speak to one another, and the peace proposal remained undelivered. Frustrated, Trist resorted to having a British diplomat pass the document to Santana. By now, Santana was in Mexico City, but he was in no position to respond to the proposal. The Mexican Congress had passed a law making it an act of treason for any official to negotiate with the United States. It was a measure aimed directly at Santana.
Santana was facing opposition from his own generals, and some of them were accusing him of selling out the country or being willing to sell out to the Americans. Considering Santana's past history, this was not an unreasonable supposition because Santana was always out for the main chance.
Esa es una situación muy curiosa, ¿no?
It was a curious situation, right? On the one hand, there was a fear of this important figure, Santana, who could declare himself dictator and with one sweep of the pen abolish Congress. But on the other hand, they knew that the only person who could pull all of the remaining forces together was Santana.
In Puebla, the private war between Nicholas Trist and Winfield Scott was coming to an end. In late June, Trist fell ill with dysentery, soon after sending Scott a conciliatory letter. The message satisfied Scott, who responded with a gift for the sick diplomat.
My dear sir, looking over my stores, I find a box of guava marmalade, which perhaps the physician may not consider improper to make part of the diet. Yours very truly, Winfield Scott.
When Trist recovered and the two men finally met, they discovered they liked one another and quickly became fast friends. But Scott now faced a serious crisis. His army's supply lines stretched 200 miles through the mountains to Veracruz. Wagon trains moving along the national road were under constant attack by bandits and guerrilla fighters. Scott's solution was both simple and daring. He would cut his supply lines to the coast. From this point on, his army would live off the land. The decision astonished an old acquaintance who had been following Scott's campaign from abroad, the Duke of Wellington, victor over Napoleon at Waterloo.
Scott is lost. He's been carried away by his successes. He can't take Mexico City, and he can't fall back on his bases. He won't leave Mexico without the permission of the Mexicans.
But for Scott, as for Cortez, who had burned his boats at Veracruz 300 years earlier, there would be no turning back. On August 5, 1847, he ordered his army to march on Mexico City.
I resolved no longer to depend on Veracruz, but to render my little army a self-sustaining machine. We had to throw away the scabbard and to advance with the naked blade in hand.
They were 2 days into the march from Puebla, more than 10,000 feet in elevation. Tomorrow, the soldiers of Winfield Scott's army would glimpse the Valley of Mexico. There, they knew they would find Mexico City and an army led by General Antonio Lopez de Santana. As the U.S. troops shivered in the cold, a few may have reached for their copies of William Prescott's History of the Conquest of Mexico to read of what Cortez and his men had seen 300 years earlier.
The Valley of Mexico, or Tenochtitlan, as more commonly called by the natives, was spread out like some gay and gorgeous panorama before them. And in the center of the Great Basin, like some Indian empress with her corona of pearls, the far-famed Venice of the Aztecs. Such was the beautiful vision which broke on the eyes of the conquerors.
On August 10, 1847, General Winfield Scott and his army marched out of the mountains to discover 3,000 feet below them the Valley of Mexico.
And near its center, the object of all our dreams and hopes, toils and dangers, once the gorgeous seat of the Montezumas. Probably not a man in the column failed to say to his neighbor or to himself, that splendid city shall soon be ours. Winfield Scott.
Not all of the soldiers were as confident as their commander. Even from a distance, they could see that Mexico City would not be easy to capture. The capital was surrounded by lakes and marshes. Only 6 causeways crossed the waters, each entering the city at a fortified gate. Outnumbered, with no hope of reinforcements, the Americans knew that retreat would be impossible. For Captain Kirby Smith, the odds against survival were all too clear.
10,000 troops to conquer a city containing near 300,000 inhabitants. We shall do it, but perhaps pay dearly for it. Mexico must fall, or we must all find a grave.
In Mexico City, church bells sent a frantic alarm echoing through the streets. The unthinkable had become a reality. The Yankee troops were approaching the capital. Since his return from Cerro Gordo, Santa Anna had worked feverishly to rebuild his army. Bells were forged into cannon and closets ransacked for old muskets. Thousands left their jobs to join the National Guard, the pride of the city.
My battalion was formed by bricklayers, tailors, carpenters, in a word, craftsmen. It was called the Independencia Battalion. Our weapons were poor because, being laborers, we were only able to buy old flintlocks. Private Perfecto Falcon.
Between new recruits and loyal veterans, Santa Anna managed to raise an army of more than 25,000 soldiers. Most of the troops were positioned at strategic points around the city. The rest would meet the Yankees east of the capital, at El Peñón, a prominent hill overlooking the National Road. Shouts and cheers filled the air as 7,000 National Guardsmen under Santa Anna's personal command marched toward El Peñón to defend their city and their nation.
Vivas to the army, to General Santana, and to the Republic rang out from all sides. The families run in masses to the streets following the troops. The brother tears himself away from his brother's arms. The wife marches at her recruit's side. The blushing lover tries to appear calm, but tears give her away. The mother cries, watches, implores for her son's safety. And the prayers and the pleas are drowned out by the monotonous sound of the military bands. Guillermo Prieto.
On August 12th, the American advance guard reached a crossroads 30 miles east of Mexico City. But to Santa Anna's surprise, Scott avoided El Peñón entirely, circling around the capital to the south.
It's a turning movement. It's a classic turning movement. He has turned Mexican defenders out of their position without firing a shot. And that is the genius of Scott in this war, his ability to do that.
Santa Anna quickly reformed his defenses, placing 20,000 soldiers in a 5-mile line between Scott and the city. To the U.S. general's east lay soggy marshland and lakes. To the west was a massive field of hardened lava, a no-man's land of sharp, jagged rock called the Pedregal. Santa Anna now had the U.S. Army's approach to the capital blocked. The strategy might have worked, but for the actions of one of Santa Anna's rivals. General Gabriel Valencia was ambitious and powerful, and he saw victory on the battlefield as his path to the presidency. Against orders, he advanced to a position near the village of Contreras. From there, he hoped to engage the U.S. Army and win glory for himself. Valencia thought his flank was protected by what everyone knew as the impassable terrain of the Pedregal. But on August 19th, the Mexican general was shocked when 3,500 U.S. troops appeared out of the volcanic wasteland. On Scott's orders, Robert E. Lee had found a way across. Valencia was now in danger of being cut off from the main body of the Mexican army. Desperately, he appealed for reinforcements. But Santa Anna refused. "Valencia is an insubordinate sot," Santa Anna said. "Let him spike his guns and retreat." That night, U.S. troops devised a bold plan, a surprise attack on Valencia's rear. Someone was needed to cross the Pedregal and return with more troops. Robert E. Lee volunteered. Working through the night, his way illuminated only by flashes of lightning and the dim light of a lamp, Lee picked his way across the treacherous field of lava and brought reinforcements back. Scott called it the greatest feat of physical and moral courage performed by anyone during the entire campaign. At daybreak on August 20th, U.S. troops launched their attack. The battle lasted only 17 minutes. 700 Mexican soldiers were killed. 813 more were taken prisoner. Among them, 4 generals.
What has occurred is the result of the stupidity committed by the disobedient Valencia and the inconceivable conduct of Santa Anna when he stood by as a motionless spectator watching the ruination of his rival. It is not the first time, nor will it be the last, that the criminal desire of generals to surpass one another results in the loss of nations. Manuel Gomez Pedraza.
Valencia's retreat spread panic through the Mexican ranks. Soon the road to Mexico City was crowded with fleeing soldiers. Scott's troops gave chase.
The double quick was sounded, and the whole advanced at a run. We soon reached the road and turned in hot pursuit. Captain Kirby Smith.
The key to the Mexican army's safe retreat was the crossing at the Churubusco River. Santa Anna had ordered the bridge there held at all costs. From behind the fortified walls of a former monastery, Mexican guns raked the ground in front of the advancing U.S. troops.
Immediately in front of us, at perhaps 500 yards, the roll of the Mexican fire exceeded anything I have ever heard. We were exposed to a dreadful crossfire which could scarcely be resisted. Captain Kirby Smith.
Heads of columns were swept away like chaff, and companies cut in pieces. Lieutenant Holloway was cut down while talking with me, and I thought of the passage, "One shall be taken, and another left." Lieutenant John James Peck.
Slowly, the firing from the Mexican guns at the monastery and bridge began to taper off.
Ammo. Where's the ammunition? Those words could be heard all over the place. Soldiers ran from one post to the next to ask their comrades if they had any cartridges. Private Perfecto Falcon.
Colonel Juan Cano, the engineer who had advised Santa Anna at Cerro Gordo, was responsible for the fortification of the monastery.
After a fatal delay, Santa Anna sent munitions. The soldiers rushed to them. The bullets were for weapons of a larger caliber. They say those desperate men tried to load the rifles with stones. Lieutenant Colonel Juan Cano.
More than once, white flags fluttered at the monastery, only to be ripped down by soldiers from the San Patricio Battalion, American deserters who had crossed over to the Mexican side. Many of them were Irish. Most were Catholic.
The San Patricio Battalion of American deserters who knew they were going to get hanged if they were captured really stiffened the backbone of the resistance and resulted in a more serious battle, I think, than Scott had any reason to expect. It was expensive. Because Scott couldn't spare a man in this campaign. He was down now probably to about 8,000 people, effectives.
After nearly 3 hours of savage fighting, Scott's forces overwhelmed the monastery, taking the defenders at bayonet point. The day-long battle from Contreras to Churubusco left a trail of bodies on the ground that stretched for miles. The Americans suffered more than 1,000 casualties. Santa Anna lost 10,000 men, a third of his troops. 3,000 were taken prisoner, including 8 generals, 2 of them former presidents of Mexico. Prefecto Falcón of the Independencia Battalion managed to escape. For him, there would be no more fighting.
We came into the city, and I changed my clothes, leaving the blue trousers with yellow stripes behind. And I went home to tell about all that had happened. Perfecto Falcón.
Once again, his army was broken and in retreat. Still, Santa Anna searched for a way to hold on to his command. That same evening, he sent envoys to Scott's headquarters to propose a truce. Scott agreed.
Willing to leave something to this republic of no immediate value to us, on which to rest her pride, I halted our victorious corps at the gates of the city.
The city of Mexico was open to Scott after Churubusco, and he stopped for political reasons, so as to give Santa Anna a chance to survive, so he could have somebody to deal with.
From a rooftop in the capital, Jose Fernando Ramirez had watched the fighting. Now, along with the rest of Mexico City, he waited to see what would happen next.
What frightens me is the future. I cannot even guess what will become of us. Tell my family that I'm safe and in good health. But my heart is broken.
The fighting had stopped. Now, the once lively streets of Mexico City were strangely quiet.
Many families had departed. The doors and balconies were closed. The sight alone of the deserted city inspired sorrow and a shudder. It resembled beauty without life, and the naked bones of a skull where lovely eyes had sparkled. Guillermo Prieto.
Santa Anna assembled the generals he still trusted. He offered his place to anyone who would take it. No one stepped forward. Now that Scott was at the gates of the capital, Santa Anna decided to accept the United States' offer to negotiate a peace. At least, it would buy him time. On August 27th, U.S. diplomat Nicholas Trist and 4 Mexican commissioners began their negotiations. But the effort was doomed from the start. Trist could offer peace only on the condition that Mexico give up territory. And Santa Anna could not agree without being accused of treason. No other Mexican politician dared risk his career by supporting a compromise.
This inability to make a decision of this magnitude is very revealing of the political situation in Mexico at this time. Nobody is willing to run the risk of something that they know is a lost cause.
Finally, a disappointed Trist broke off the talks, convinced that Santa Anna had let his last chance slip away.
Santa Anna could not bring himself to take the plunge into his Rubicon, and allowed himself to be carried along by a flood of circumstance, staking all upon a battle everyone felt sure he would lose.
The peace talks had failed. Now the truce itself began to crumble. Scott was convinced that Santa Anna had been using the time to fortify the city in violation of the terms of the armistice. On September 6th, he demanded that Santa Anna surrender by noon the next day. Unable to make peace, Santa Anna decided on the only remaining alternative. He wrote back to Scott,
Yours will be the responsibility before the world, which readily will perceive whose is the part of moderation and justice.
So he fights up to the last minute. And in that sense, he was like the Mexican people of the time. You have to exhaust every possibility.
Once more, soldiers on both sides prepared for battle.
My never forgotten and beloved Catita. Although the Yankees will enter Mexico City, it does not follow that they will be the conquerors of the Mexican nation. These evil men will remain masters only of the territory they walk on, and the whole nation will rise up and destroy them.
The truce was over. The battle for Mexico City would soon begin. Scott ordered his engineers to scout the causeways into the capital. There were two possible attack routes, one from the south, through the gate of San Antonio, the other from the west, through the gates of San Cosme and Belén. On the western approach was an old flour mill called Molino del Rey. Rumors spoke of stockpiles of gunpowder there and a foundry where bells were being turned into cannons. Scott ordered the mill captured. As evening touched the American camp, Captain Kirby Smith took a moment to write his wife.
My dearest, I almost despair when I reflect upon the destitute situation in which you will be left, with the 3 children dependent on you, should I fall in the coming battle. Tomorrow will be a day of slaughter. I am thankful you do not know the peril we are in. Good night.
The next morning, U.S. soldiers advanced on the mill, only to be surprised by a devastating volley of Mexican artillery. Soon, 3,500 U.S. troops found themselves engaged in a desperate battle with Mexican forces numbering 10,000. The bloody fighting raged for more than 2 hours. Time and again, U.S. soldiers charged into the fearsome fire. Our troops fought like heroes, said Lieutenant John Peck, and were mowed like grass. The battle for Molino del Rey cost Scott's forces some 800 casualties. Among the dead was the temporary commander of the light infantry, Captain Kirby Smith. For Santa Anna's troops, the toll was far higher. Surprised by the persistence of the American attack, the Mexican forces slowly withdrew. As the U.S. troops searched the buildings, they were forced to accept a bitter irony. The cannon works so many had given their lives for did not exist. Inside the gates of Mexico City, the residents could only wonder when the final attack would come.
The church bells, which have been silent for many days, ring only to spread the alarm. Half the inhabitants crowd the rooftops to see what their fate may be, while the other half lock themselves indoors or rush to prepare to defend themselves to the last. Jose Fernando Ramirez.
Santa Anna stationed troops and artillery at the southern and western gates to the city and at Chapultepec Castle, which dominated the approach from the west. Now he waited to see from which direction the U.S. forces would launch their assault on the capital. For Winfield Scott, the stakes had never been higher. One of every 5 soldiers who had marched into the valley with him had fallen. Another costly battle like the one from Molino del Rey would be his last. Finally, Scott made his decision. He would attack Mexico City from the west. Against the advice of some of his officers, the general ordered an assault on Chapultepec Castle. General William Worth, one of Scott's best, most experienced commanders, had argued against an attack on Chapultepec. After the decision, he was heard to mutter, "We shall be defeated." At sunrise on the next morning, September 12th, U.S. artillery began blasting at Chapultepec's walls and rooftops. The shelling lasted 14 hours, but the Mexican troops held firm. Inside the castle, General Nicolas Bravo led 832 defenders, including more than 50 cadets from the military college. As shells ripped through the castle walls, Bravo urgently appealed to Santa Anna for reinforcements, but none arrived.
Santa Anna was constantly crossing the avenue, ordering soldiers to march, searching out the most dangerous places with reckless valor. I see him now, with his Panama hat, whip in hand, his overcoat and pants of white as linen. His actions served no purpose, and just as he cannot be called a traitor, he cannot justly be considered a good general. Guillermo Prieto.
Colonel Juan Cano, who had helped fortify the Mexican positions at Cerro Gordo and Churubusco, worked desperately to repair Chapultepec's battered defenses. Cano knew time was running out. That night, he ordered his brother, Lorenzo, to take a sealed message to their uncle. It was a request for supplies, Juan Cano said, nothing more. When Lorenzo delivered the message, he learned otherwise.
Querido tío. Dear uncle, I am certain that tomorrow we shall die. I don't want my elderly parents to suffer the unbearable grief of learning that two sons have died at the same time. So I beg you, keep my brother Lorenzo from returning to my side. If he were here at Chapultepec, I am sure he would die with me. Juan Cano.
As dawn broke the next morning, the U.S. infantry advanced towards the castle. Guillermo Prieto watched as the soldiers marched through a forest dating back to the time of the Aztecs.
My forest, my childhood paradise, my playground of youth. To see it bruised and wounded, trampled by the invader, tormented me as if I were seeing my father's body stepped on and humiliated. Guillermo Prieto.
500 volunteers made up the lead assault party. Following Army tradition, they called themselves the Forlorn Hope. With scaling ladders in place, the men scrambled up and into the face of the Mexican guns.
The Yankees climbed like goats. Clearing all the rocks and thicket, they came to the main door of the top plaza, trampling over everything. There they bumped into Colonel Cano, very resolute with gun in hand. Two of them asked for his sword. He shut their mouths with a gun. They fell on him and killed him.
At the height of the battle, 400 Mexican sharpshooters from the San Blas Battalion charged up the hill in a courageous attempt to join their comrades. But the reinforcements arrived too late, and most were cut down trying to reach the castle. The assault on Chapultepec ended in bloody hand-to-hand fighting that spared few of the Mexican defenders. Among those who fell were some of the Mexican cadets, the youngest just 13 years old. 6, it was said, chose to die rather than surrender. They would become national heroes in Mexico, the boy heroes of Chapultepec. Legend holds that one of them, Juan Escutia, wrapped himself in Mexico's flag and plunged to his death from the castle wall. From a nearby hill, 30 of the American deserters captured at Churubusco with the San Patricio Battalion watched, standing in mule carts with ropes around their necks. Finally, the U.S. flag was raised over the castle. Chapultepec had fallen. As the U.S. flag fluttered on the wind, the officer in charge of the execution gave the signal, and the carts lurched forward.
If there's ever a case where there's two different points of view, this is one, because To the Mexicans, the San Patricios are patriots. Few American military have any sympathy for them.
With Chapultepec Castle no longer a threat, Scott's troops battled their way up the two western causeways, taking both San Cosme and Belen gates by the end of the day. That night, Santa Anna met with his key commanders and several political leaders to decide the city's fate.
I think among the most tragic moments in the history of Mexico is that night, September 13th, when the last recourse, the last possibility, or nearly the last possibility, of defending Mexico City was exhausted. And evidently for General Santa Anna, it's terrible to have to accept that he's failed again.
A little after 11 o'clock, a carriage came for General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna. Later in the night, some 9,000 troops followed him out of the city. At 4 o'clock the next morning, September 14th, a delegation of city leaders went to Scott's headquarters and surrendered. Within hours, General Scott's army entered the Plaza de Armas, the heart of the capital, in triumph. Some resistance did come from an unexpected quarter. Santa Anna had emptied the jails, and the prisoners joined thousands of beggars and indigents coursing through the streets. Only a few had weapons. Most could only heave stones at the invaders.
Sad to say, this generous effort by the lower classes was bitterly denounced by the privileged classes, people who could look with indifference on the humiliation of their country if they could only preserve their own interests and comforts. Guillermo Prieto.
It's very clear to many people that if these lower class people are armed, they will conquer Scott's 10,000 soldiers and continue with a nationwide social revolution. This could not be permitted. They'd rather lose whatever there is to lose against the United States than risk a social upheaval that could wipe the privileged classes off the map.
As the Americans tightened their grip on the capital, Santa Anna resigned his presidency. Manuel de la Peña y Peña, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, became president of Mexico. Within a month, Peña y Peña ordered Santa Anna court-martialed and stripped of his command. Wanted by his own government and pursued by U.S. soldiers, Santa Anna finally fled to exile in Jamaica. In a farewell message to the country, he defended himself with a familiar blend of self-pity and pride.
Fellow citizens, misfortune has deprived me of the incomparable satisfaction of presenting to you a splendid victory. But never have I committed a crime against my country. A good name, when I am gone, is the height of my ambition. I have wished all that is great and glorious for Mexico, and to obtain it, I have not spared even my own blood. This you know, and will do me justice.
Even with U.S. forces in control of Mexico City, Winfield Scott faced a perilous situation. The United States Army had never before occupied a foreign capital. All that had happened to now, the sacrifices on both sides, would mean nothing without a treaty. It was the moment that Peace Commissioner Nicholas Trist had been waiting for, an opportunity to claim his place in history. But before the talks could start, Trist received a stunning dispatch from Washington. He had been fired.
October 6th, 1847. The President, believing that your continued presence with the Army can be productive of no good, has directed me to recall you from your mission. He has determined not to make another offer to treat with the Mexican government. They must now sue for peace. James Buchanan, U.S. Secretary of State.
Interim President Manuel de la Peña y Peña urged Trist to stay. For weeks, Mexican leaders had struggled to form a government stable enough to even attempt negotiations.
At this time, it was necessary for the Mexicans to negotiate because they were afraid of losing all of their territory, or even more territory than that already occupied in the north and demanded by the United States.
In Mexico, Trist was trusted by both sides. Without him, everyone feared the negotiations would collapse. Pressed by both Scott and Peña y Peña to remain, Trist made his decision. In a condescending 65-page letter, he informed Buchanan of his intention to disobey his president.
If the present opportunity be not seized at once, all chance of making a treaty at all will be lost, probably forever.
Trist knew his response would take weeks to reach Washington, and more weeks would pass while an angry reply worked its way to Mexico. Meanwhile, he would try to negotiate a peace. The talks lasted 2 months, but by late January of 1848, Nicholas Trist and the Mexican peace commissioners had agreed on most of the terms of a treaty. The United States would pay Mexico $15 million. The lands of Upper California and New Mexico would be ceded to the United States.
The Mexicans fought very hard not to cede New Mexico. They fought to keep Southern California, which was also more inhabited by Mexicans, and above all, they fought for the area from the Nueces to the Bravo.
These were the lands over which blood had first been shed. But here Trist would not give in. The border with Texas would be drawn at the Bravo, the Rio Grande. For the Mexicans living in the territory transferred to the United States, there would be a choice. They could stay on their land and choose either U.S. or Mexican citizenship, or they could leave. Most would choose to stay.
The border is created, this artificial political border, and suddenly a family, part of the family is on one side, and the other part of the family is on the other side. So it splits families, it pulls them apart, and they are suddenly not only on opposite sides of the border, but politically, because the war continued to be fought in many respects, although no longer militarily. They are now, in that sense, enemies. Although they don't construct themselves that way, or they don't see themselves that way.
On February 2nd, 1848, Trist and the Mexican commissioners met in the town of Guadalupe Hidalgo, near the Basilica of the Virgin of Guadalupe, the patron saint of Mexico. Here they signed the document that would become known as the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Years later, Trist told his wife Virginia that at the time his sense of duty had forced him to hide his feelings. During the signing, one of the Mexican commissioners, Jose Bernardo Couto, remarked to Trist, "This must be a proud moment for you. No less proud for you than it is humiliating for us."
To this, Mr. Trist replied, "We are making peace. Let that be our only thought." But, said he to us in relating it, could those Mexicans have seen into my heart at that moment, they would have known that my feeling of shame as an American was far stronger than theirs could be.
The treaty arrived in Washington on February 19th. Polk was still incensed at Trist's insubordination. But the president was also worried that extreme expansionists would try to prolong the war. Finding the treaty itself acceptable, Polk submitted it to the Senate without changes. He knew that ratification would face strong opposition from those who wanted to take all of Mexico.
A force must be poured into the country sufficiently powerful to overawe resistance. It is a glorious prospect, this annexation of all Mexico. New York Herald.
But there were others in the Senate who feared the consequences of granting citizenship to Mexicans. Among them was John C. Calhoun of South Carolina.
We have never dreamt of incorporating into our union any but the Caucasian race, the free white race. The greatest misfortunes of Spanish America are to be traced to the fatal error of placing these colored races on an equality with the white race.
In the end, the moderates prevailed, and the U.S. Senate approved the treaty. The United States' dream of manifest destiny was now a reality. From the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean, the nation had become a transcontinental power. Now it was up to Mexico to ratify the signed treaty. President Peña y Peña confronted extremist factions of his own in the Mexican Congress. Some delegates argued for continuing the war. Too many had sacrificed too much to accept defeat.
When the war between Mexico and the United States was over, it left a profound frustration among the Mexican people, because common people, everyday citizens, had seen their neighbors, their brothers, and ordinary soldiers die in a war that, for all the bloodshed, had resulted in the loss of half of Mexico's territory.
At the beginning of the war, Manuel de la Peña y Peña had called for peace. Now he would preside over the dismemberment of his nation. It was, he said, his journey to the grave. Even so, he urged the Mexican people to accept the treaty.
The people have an incontestable right not to have to suffer more. It would be a great inhumanity to put them through all the horrors of a renewed and bloody battle, especially after the many years of civil war. The truth is that a fertile and beautiful part of our territory is being ceded. I have no wish to obscure the truth, much less to deny the pain I feel at the separation from the Mexicans of California and New Mexico. The territories have not been given up for the sum of $15 million, but to recover our ports and invaded cities, to bring order to a people who have not ceased to suffer for 37 years. Let us do the right thing. Let us strip off the veil that has prevented us from seeing the reality of things. Let us make a mighty effort so that our children will not curse our memory.
On May 30th, 1848, the Mexican Congress approved the treaty. The war was officially over.
It was the end of a dream, the end, finally, of the greatness of New Spain, which, although it had faded, traces still remained. Now, suddenly, it was obvious that all that was history.
I think the biggest thing that Americans have to realize is that the Mexicans have not forgotten this. And so if we think that we are being friendly, hospitable, generous in dealing with the Mexicans these days and find that they have some reserve because they're very conscious of history, I think an understanding of the Mexican War will let us understand better how they feel about it.
I would like to leave as a final reflection the only benefit we had from this shocking experience. Of course, it was a painful mutilation of our territory,
But in exchange, very expensively for sure, we found a spirit of Mexican identity.
On the 4th of July, 1848, U.S. veterans of the war with Mexico marched proudly on parade in their nation's capital. Later that same day, the countersigned Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo arrived from Mexico City. James K. Polk had proved a man of his word. The goals he had set before the Congress and the nation early in his term had been fulfilled.
Monday, August 14th, 1848. I am heartily rejoiced that the session of Congress is over. My long confinement and great labor has exhausted me, and I feel the absolute necessity of having a rest.
Polk had hoped that his success would benefit his beloved Democratic Party, but his reward proved bitter. On Inauguration Day in 1849, he watched as his political rival, Zachary Taylor, the victor of Monterey and Buena Vista, was sworn in as the 12th President of the United States. Exhausted, Polk returned to his home in Tennessee. 3 months later, he was dead. Although defeated in battle and forced into exile, Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna would be called to the presidency of his country yet again in 1853. 2 years later, he was back in exile, not to return to Mexico for nearly 20 years.
I have drunk the cup of bitterness drop by drop. Nevertheless, I shall congratulate with the greatest pleasure the fortunate countryman who brings peace to our native land.
Santa Anna lived out his remaining years in obscurity, without the wealth and fame he had so eagerly sought in his youth. In the end, all that remained was the loyalty of his wife, Doña Dolores Tosta de Santa Anna.
Paga a gente del pueblo para que se acerque al balcón de la casa.
She pays the people of the town to gather around the balcony of his house and shout, "Viva Santa Anna!" And Santa Anna would step out onto the balcony to thank the adoring public.
Si no sintiéndose que es,
if he didn't feel he was once again president, he could feel that it was once again possible. That was his fundamental reason for living.
In the fall of 1848, Guillermo Prieto and the other writers of Apuntes, Notes for the History of the War between the United States and Mexico, published their work.
There remained in our hearts a feeling of sadness for the evils the war had produced, and in our minds a fruitful lesson of how difficult it is to uphold the defense and salvation of a people when disorder, acrimony, and anarchy prevail. Guillermo Prieto.
Para México, perdimos el territorio.
For Mexico, we lost the territory.
Pero la experiencia de ser invadidos,
but the experience of being invaded gave us Mexicans the necessary elements
para pensar y recomponer,
to rethink, to recreate our country and consolidate our nation.
Nuestra nación.
In the years following the war with the United States, Mexico would continue to struggle with political division, civil war, and foreign intervention. But in 1867, in the aftermath of the War of the Reform, President Benito Juárez was able to unite Mexico and defeat a French invasion of the country. Unlike the divided republic that had confronted the United States, Mexico had become a stronger nation. Even so, the North American invasion would never be forgotten.
It is difficult to overcome a defeat so traumatic, so painful. But in time, we will have to assimilate that. Surely, it's been a long time, and we have more important things to do in order to build a viable, modern, progressive, free, and just nation.
In the United States, many Americans had become convinced that theirs was a republic for the ages, a model for the rest of the world to follow. The professional army General Winfield Scott had championed throughout his career would help transform the United States into an international power.
There was a popular feeling the United States has this destiny to become a world leader in industrial development, in commercial activity, and even in reference to progress in the arts and sciences and intellectual advance and intellectual achievement. This is all part of this idea of boundlessness, of no limits. This is this romantic notion that through an act of will, individuals, Americans, can achieve this greatness for themselves and for their nation.
But the United States' sudden expansion inflamed an issue that had haunted the nation since birth. Would these lands be slave or free? It was a question that would drive the Republic into civil war. When Generals Robert E. Lee and Ulysses S. Grant finally shook hands at Appomattox in 1865, they sought to ease the moment with talk of their experience in Mexico 18 years earlier. Near the end of his life, a disillusioned Ulysses Grant would write of the war with Mexico.
I regard the war as one of the most unjust ever waged by a stronger against a weaker nation.
There were others who shared Grant's opinion that the United States had been at fault.
And if not at fault, that it did not fully live up to its ideology as expressed in the noblest of the American writings on democracy and freedom. This was an aggressive war in which we attacked a neighbor, and however much we may have won from the war, we do not like to look at the way in which we won it.
The lands taken from Mexico would become an important source of wealth for a growing United States. The discovery of gold in California spurred a great westward migration of entrepreneurs and settlers seeking new opportunities. For Native Americans, it was the latest invasion of their homeland and the beginning of another struggle for survival that would continue for generations.
In the far distant past, the world seemed large enough for both the red man and the white man. He once came to trade. He comes now to fight. He covers his face with clouds of jealousy and anger and tells us to be gone. Saint Agya, Sitting Bear.
After the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, more than 75,000 Mexicans chose to remain on land which had now become part of the United States. Most would become U.S. citizens, but many would lose the land on which their families had lived for generations.
The United States does not claim them as full citizens. As a matter of fact, immediately almost sets up multiple barriers and multiple obstacles so that they are not considered full citizens, neither they nor the indigenous peoples that were already here either. And Mexico has lost sight of them, has lost them. So what of them? Who, not only who are these people, but they don't have, now they don't have a homeland and they don't have a nation.
In California, even the wealthy Mariano Vallejo was unable to retain his place in the new order. In what many believed was a violation of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, Vallejo was required to prove the validity of his land grants from Mexico. The legal battle forced him to sell much of his property to pay lawyers. In the end, he lost the rest to Yankee mortgage holders. The wheel of fortune is very fickle, Vallejo would write. It hit me among the first. At the time of his death in 1890, all that remained of his once vast estate was 228 acres, 2 horses, and a cow.
The violence is not just military, but it is a violence of the soul. It is a violence of the spirit. by those who commit that violence as well as by those who are on the receiving end. And from my perspective, we still live that violence. That violence has not healed. We live with the consequences of that violence. And for me, for us to go beyond that is to come to terms with it, is to acknowledge it.
In 1947, Harry Truman became the first U.S. president to ever visit Mexico City.
Unexpectedly, Mr. Truman makes an out-of-the-way stop at the Chapultepec Monument. Here he pays a simple tribute to the memory of Mexican youths who died 100 years ago defending their nation's capital against an American army. All Mexico was tremendously moved by this act.
Truman brought to Mexico a promise.
To observe the doctrine of non-intervention. What it means is that a strong nation does not have the right to impose its will by reason of its strength upon a weaker nation.
The sooner we Mexicans confront how we have been in the presence of the United States, the better we'll be able to relate to the North Americans. Enough of myths that we are the victims of imperialism. Yes, certainly we were, and we were many other things as well. Our conditions in Mexico helped the United States and enabled it to do what it did, and to some degree, what it is doing even today. So for me, it seems that the war is a very important example of what Mexicans should recognize about how we were, what enormous problems we faced in such a critical time as the war, because it is absolutely necessary that we demystify our relations with the United States at a time when we are resolving new boundaries in terms of geopolitics, culture, and economics.
And I think that war, studying that war, it will help for a better future for those two countries that cannot change geography. They have to live together.
To learn more and talk with others about this series, visit the bilingual U.S.-Mexican War website at www.pbs.org. This series has been made possible by grants from the following: the National Endowment for the Humanities, expanding America's understanding of who we were, who we are, and who we will be; the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and the annual financial support from viewers like you; the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation; and the Meadows Foundation. Additional support has been provided by the Arthur Vining Davis Foundations, the Summerlee Foundation, and the following organizations and individuals: